In Objective 3, we're going to use the contribution margin approach that we have just discussed to do some analysis for profit planning using what we will call CVP analysis, cost, volume, profit. And so when we're talking about cost, volume, profit, exactly like the phrase says, we're going to analyze how cost increase with volume and how that increase in cost and volume impacts our profits and losses. And we will use this information by separating our total cost into the variable cost that will move with volume, the fixed cost that will not, and the mixed cost that combine some of both of those costs, and how we analyze those different cost relationships to make business decisions in our organization. So there are some assumptions that we use in cost, volume, profit analysis. And so we have to be aware that when we're making the calculations using cost, volume, profit analysis, they're just estimates. But still, it's a very good use of estimates to try to predict profitability and efficiency in our organization in the future. So the things that we're assuming is that the price per unit is not going to change as volume changes. So we're talking about selling price, not cost here. So if we're talking about the smart tablets, let's assume they're going to sell for $500 regardless if we sell 1,000 units or 2,000 units. We also assume that managers have the ability, to classify cost as either variable, fixed, or mixed, because we need to separate them in the upcoming formulas. Also, we're assuming, a large assumption here, but we're assuming the only factor that is impacting total cost primarily is volume, and that the more volume we have, the more cost we have, once again, within that relevant range. Also, assuming, as we've mentioned, that fixed costs do not change, and they can, we can increase salaries of supervisors. I can add an additional supervisor. I can buy additional machinery. So there are opportunities for fixed costs to increase, but we're assuming in each of these situations moving forward, unless that information is given to us, that the fixed cost will not change and that there are no changes in inventory levels. This is a company that is manufacturing what they can sell. They're not doing a buildup of inventory or a liquidation of inventory. So these inventory levels and fixed costs are going to remain consistent in these assumptions. So there are three approaches that we can use to estimate what your book calls a target profit for a company: an equation approach, contribution margin approach, and a contribution margin ratio approach. So what do we mean by target profit? If I want to estimate the number of units that I need to sell or the amount of sales dollars that I need to generate X amount of operating income, how can I do that? These are the three approaches. We'll take a look at each one. The first is probably the most simplistic, but can be the longest to calculate. So we know that if we want to estimate profit, that we have to estimate the number of units that a company needs to sell to get to that profit. So it is simply sales less our total cost equals whatever operating income we're trying to generate, whatever, and use the phrases interchangeably here. Let me get a marker for you. So when we're talking about operating income, we can use this phrase interchangeably with target profit. They should have used the same phrases here, but it's called operating income on our statement, and that's why they've left it that way. But we're trying to identify, if I have a target amount that I want to meet, what can I do? I can use this equation approach. So to understand that equation, we have to understand the relationship between variable cost and fixed cost. So remember, if I want to know my sales revenue, then it is simply how many units have I sold times the amount that I'm selling those units for. So the number of smart tablets sold times $500 per unit. That's my sales revenue. So remember, for every tablet we sell, there are some variable costs associated with it. The material, the labor, and the overhead, that the more we produce, the more batteries we need, remember? So variable cost is not just an individual number. We know, like we determined in the high-low method, what our variable cost per unit is. We multiply the variable cost per unit times the number of units sold. So obviously, this number should be the same. Okay, and we're trying to figure out how many units. Okay, so this is our unknown. Units sold. This is what I'm trying to solve for if I'm trying to determine a target profit. So if we were to set this up in an algebraic equation, it's simply going to say 500 minus 275 times X. Okay, that is our variable cost. So we've determined sales less variable cost, but we also have to cover fixed cost. Right, so once we've got sales less variable cost less fixed cost, then how many units do I have to sell to generate a target profit of $6,000? So once again, remember, this is our unknown. This is what we are trying to ultimately solve for. It's just an algebraic formula. Okay, so we end up, when we walk through this algebraic formula, with $225 per unit equals 18 times the number of units sold equals 18,000. So to calculate for units sold, I've got 18,000 divided by 225 per unit. I need to sell 80 units to generate a profit of $6,000. So before we move to the next method, which your book called the contribution margin approach, take a look at what we've done here. Remember, contribution margin was sales less, as sloppy as this is, okay, sales less variable cost equal contribution margin. Well, look at what we've done. Sales, $500 per unit, less variable cost, $275 per unit. In this particular situation, what I have calculated is contribution margin. $225 is contribution margin per unit. Keep that in mind as we move forward to the next slide, which walks us through the contribution margin approach. Your book calls it a shortcut, okay, of calculating, once again, the number of units that we need to sell. And so what simply happens here is I need enough contribution margin per unit. And what did we just say back here? I have calculated my contribution margin per unit right here. So what I want to know is, okay, go back to this existing slide. I need to sell enough units. This is what we're looking at here. I need to sell enough units to cover fixed cost and my target profit. Okay, so remember, if we go back to a prior lecture, I told you when we have sales less variable cost as contribution margin, once fixed costs are covered, that contribution margin basically becomes profit. So what we want to know here is I need to cover fixed cost plus whatever target profit that I need to cover, and I'm dividing that by contribution margin per unit. Once again, sales per unit less variable cost per unit is going to equal contribution margin per unit. So I am simply using my contribution margin to determine how many units I need to sell to break even. Now, once again, we're determining units, and it's the same as before. Let me back up a slide instead of moving forward. It's the same as before. We would calculate 80 units using this method because we're going to come to this using the formula approach. We've simply come down and eliminated the equation approach to just these two lines. This is the 18,000 is my fixed cost, 6,000. Fixed cost of 12,000 plus my target profit of 6,000. So 18,000 is my fixed cost plus my target profit divided by contribution margin per unit. So the contribution margin approach simply takes this whole equation that we see and breaks it down to these two lines. Fixed cost plus target profit divided by contribution margin per unit, 80 units. Now, the third method that we're going to discuss is the contribution margin ratio approach. But before we move there, and what that ratio approach is going to do is help us calculate the dollar amount of sales that we need to generate to break even or to generate a certain amount of profit. Well, if I know that I need to sell 80 units to generate a $6,000 profit margin, if I want to convert that to dollars, I can simply say 80 units are what I need to sell. I'm selling them for $500 a unit. So if I say 80 units times $500 per unit, I'm going to come up with sales of $4,000. All right, so it's as simple as how many units times what I'm selling those units for. These are my sales dollars. But we can also do this in a formula when we don't have all of that information available to us as easily. And it's simply called the contribution margin ratio approach. Like I mentioned in the prior slide, I'm trying to determine sales dollars. Okay, sales dollars instead of units. And in order to do that, in the same process here, we're going to take the same thing, our fixed cost and target profit. I need to cover fixed costs plus my target profit. Instead of dividing by contribution margin per unit, I'm going to divide by contribution margin ratio. And what was that ratio? It's simply contribution margin divided by sales dollars. Okay, so the top box tells us how we actually come up with the ratio, which is simply nothing more than contribution margin divided by sales. This is my contribution margin ratio. So if I take that same 18,000 that I was trying to generate and divide it by 45%, I get 40,000. 40,000 sales dollars. So I messed up back here. Let me back up in my math. If we have 80 units, right, I need another zero. Let's add another zero here. 40,000. Sorry about that. But the same process works. I either know the number of units I need to sell and I multiply it times the sales price of 500, or I can use I can simply use the contribution margin ratio approach and divide my fixed cost and target profit by my contribution margin ratio. It will generate sales. Okay, so let me say that again. If I divide by the contribution margin ratio, I get the number of sales dollars that I need to generate this profit. If I divide by contribution margin per unit, I'm going to get the number of units that I need to generate this desired profit. Okay, so you can begin to see, it's kind of nice, I think, when you've had some time to stop and wrap your brain around this, we can predict how many units we need to manufacture to acquire a certain profit. So that helps us in determining whether we need to even take on this endeavor with a certain product or not. And so the numbers begin to come together in a management perspective to show us how efficient we need to be in our organization. Now we can also use the same three formulas that we just mentioned to calculate break even. And break even is simply at the point where, as your slide says, your total revenues equal your total cost. There is zero operating income at break even. I'm simply generating enough sales to cover all of my costs. So if I want to know how many products that I need to sell to break even, I can use the same thing that I just did in trying to come up with a $6,000 profit. I simply set my target profit to zero. Zero is break even. I make no profit. I simply cover all my cost. Sales less all my cost equals zero. Okay, so the same thing. I'm not going to walk you through the formulas again. You can go back and take a look at them if you would like. The same three formulas can be used to calculate break even. So we're simply saying that all my sales less all of my variable and fixed cost equals zero, or my fixed cost plus a zero target profit is what I need to cover to break even. And so we can use the formulas to determine if we're going to reach break even, or we can use the formulas to determine how many units we might need to sell to meet a desired goal above and beyond that. So if we look at it in graphic form, okay, let's take a look at our graph here. First of all, notice the sales line in blue. Our sales start at zero. And as we move up at this point, sales up to, remember this was our fixed cost line, I have not generated any profit with this product because I've just at this point covered my fixed cost. Okay, so I'm at a loss at this point if I calculate sales less total cost, because I can't even cover fixed costs, much less, okay, remember these are in this first shaded area here, these are my variable cost. All right, and at this point I have just covered my fixed cost, but I haven't covered all of my variable. So if we take our sales up a little bit further, if you'll notice here, your book calls this our break-even point, because at this point I have covered all of my fixed cost. All right, sales are increasing. Okay, we can see our line is moving up here. Okay, we're still increasing, but our fixed cost line does not change. It is staying the same. Even though volume is increasing, fixed costs stay the same. But we have another cost line. We have this total cost line that we're looking at, and it's in the green. So if we follow this green line for total cost, total covers our fixed and our variable cost, and we see at this point the blue line, my sales, is enough to cover all of my fixed cost plus my variable cost. Okay, now once again, remember what I told you about sales as variable cost as contribution margin? And once we have covered all of our fixed cost, then my sales less my variable cost are still contribution margin. All of my contribution margin is profit because I no longer have to cover additional fixed cost. So if you'll notice, as our sales continue to increase, fixed costs stay the same. They're not moving up. But these total costs, okay, which now only consist of variable, because fixed costs are covered, now this only consists of variable cost. And if I'm manufacturing my smart tablets, for every smart tablet I sell, I've got some batteries and some other material and other labor that's associated directly with those tablets. But we see the gap of income. Okay, so if you'll notice, it gets a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger as we go, because now I'm only having to cover variable cost to generate profit and not fixed cost. Okay, so we begin to see that gap grow. So can you understand why it's important to know where is this break-even point? And once I get to that break-even point, how many units do I need to sell to generate a certain amount of profit, realizing that the profit is going to grow disproportionately now since the fixed costs are covered? Right? So it gives us a pictorial graph of how these costs are actually moving and what we can use cost volume profit analysis to do to make business decisions in our organization. Okay, so once again, we'll stop, take some notes, and then we're going to take learning objective 3 one step further and look at cost volume profit analysis, doing some sensitivity or what if situations in the next objective.